This is a history we often tell as a story of disappearance. But that's just not the whole picture. What if we looked at it differently? Not as a simple, tragic fall, but as a great unraveling. A story of absolute cataclysm for sure, but also one of incredible survival and ultimately rebirth. So let's dive into that story, the story of Indigenous resilience. This quote right here really gets to the heart of it all. We have this idea that what happened was just unavoidable, a sad consequence of progress. But it wasn't, not even close. It was the result of deliberate choices, of policies and actions designed to clear a path for empire. To really understand what was lost, and maybe more importantly, what has endured, we have to go back, way back, before this continent was ever called the New World. We need to see it for what it was, an ancient world, full of nations. Okay, so the one word you really need to get is sovereignty. And this wasn't some abstract idea. For nations like the Haudenosaunee, their Great Law of Peace created a multi-state democracy that actually influenced the US Constitution. Sovereignty was a daily reality. It meant complex legal systems, huge trade networks, and the power to govern themselves. So let's get that old image of an empty wilderness out of our heads. It's just wrong. The Americas were a bustling continent of nations. We're talking vast trade routes that stretched from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It was a world governed by intricate laws and fed by brilliant farming techniques. These were established sovereign powers. But the first blow to this world, the one that began the unraveling, well, it wasn't struck by a sword or a cannon. It was invisible, it was silent, and it was unbelievably deadly. Think about it. Before a single major battle was fought, before the ink was dry on any treaty, an invisible soldier had already landed. European diseases, things that indigenous peoples had zero immunity to, spread faster and further than any army, clearing a truly devastating path for colonization. The impact was just catastrophic. Smallpox didn't just kill people, it erased living libraries. It took elders, leaders, storytellers, the keepers of entire cultures. Measles could sweep through and cripple a community's ability to plant or harvest, which then led to famine. You see, this wasn't just a health crisis. It was the start of the entire social fabric coming apart. And this number, it's just staggering. In many, many regions, the death toll was upwards of 90%. Just try to wrap your head around that. That's 9 out of every 10 people you know, gone. It was a biological apocalypse. And many nations were still reeling from that when the next wave of the assault began. So as we move into the 1800s, the fight shifts. With populations so weakened by disease, the weapons changed. They weren't just microscopic anymore. They were political. They were the pen and the bayonet, the law and the army that was there to enforce it. On paper, treaties looked like these formal agreements between two equal sovereign powers. That was the promise, but in practice, they became blueprints for dispossession. The promise of mutual respect often just hid the brutal reality of a relentless land grab. A nation's signature became the very tool used to shrink its own world. And look at how relentless this was, just over a few decades. Bam, 1830, the Indian Removal Act starts kicking entire nations out of the Southeast. Then, 1838, the horror of the Trail of Tears. In the 1870s, you've got the targeted slaughter of millions of buffalo, basically to start the Plains nations into submission. And then, 1887, the Dawes Act comes for the very idea of community by breaking up communal lands. Every single one was a calculated step to dismantle sovereignty. But taking the land, taking the resources, believe it or not, that wasn't enough. The final front was an attack on identity itself. This was an assault on the soul. Kill the Indian, save the man. Just let that sink in for a second. This was the official philosophy of the American Indian boarding school system. The goal was not to educate. The goal was to erase, to systematically strip away a child's language, their culture, their spirituality, their family, and replace it with something else. And the process was brutally methodical. First, removal. Children were taken, often by force, from their families. Then, isolation, sent to boarding schools hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. Then, re-education. They were beaten for speaking their own language. And when you combine that with policies like the Dawes Act dividing up their homelands, the strategy becomes pretty clear. Dissolve the very idea of being a nation. So after all of that, disease, dispossession, assimilation. It's so easy to see this as just a story of loss, a tragedy from start to finish. But is that really the whole story? Did something manage to survive through that great unraveling? Yes, because here's the most important part. This story does not end in ashes. This isn't a eulogy. It's a story of a cycle of cataclysm, yes, but now a cycle of rebirth.
And you see it happening right now, all across this continent. That sovereignty is being reclaimed. You have language immersion schools bringing ancestral tongues back from the very brink of extinction. Tribal courts are asserting their legal authority. Indigenous leaders are at the absolute forefront of the environmental movement. And vibrant cultural celebrations, like powwows, show the world an identity that simply refused to be erased.
And really, that's the ultimate takeaway here. The empires of the 19th century, they seized the map, they redrew it by force, shattered the political landscape. But they couldn't extinguish the nations themselves. The people, the cultures, the spirit, they endured, they survived. So that brings us right back to where we started, sovereignty. When you really understand this history, both the destruction and the rebirth, it forces you to ask a really important question. What does it mean to honor Indigenous sovereignty today, right now? In our laws, in our communities, in the future we're all building together. Because this story isn't over, not by a long shot. It's being written as we speak.